Today in this video, we're going to walk through the different ways to model charitable donations within Holistiplan. For example purposes, I'll be using clients Michael and Ann Doe. A little background on Michael and Ann. They are a retired couple in their early to mid 70s. As I go through this, you'll see they have some investment income. They are currently collecting on their required minimum distributions or taking RMDs. They each have a small pension. If I open up that taxable pensions and annuities worksheet, you can see they each are taking a small one there. And then they also are both taking Social Security. Of course, they are over age 70 now. And they have come to you in this first example. They're curious to see in the past, did they've always itemized, or at least since the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, that increase in the standard deduction, that's just always been more optimal or beneficial for them in their tax situation. However, this year, they're wondering what would happen if we made a charitable donation and we made a charitable donation that exceeded that standard deduction amount. So, how we might want to model this for them so they can see the difference in the tax liability. We would start with our base case here. You have, as a best practice, I create tax year. We're now in 2023. You have this base case in parentheses. And then here, I would add a scenario, copy, and then use that base case as the copy to start. And then in order to model the itemization schedule or Schedule A, we scroll down to Schedule A, Itemized Deduction section, and then there is a charitable worksheet that you want to open up, we'll call Charity Worksheet, and they're donating cash. So we want to use this cash donation to 50% limit organizations. There is that 60% AGI limit per that TCJA, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Right there, they're interested in modeling 35,000 for example purposes. Here we see that pop right in there for Schedule A. We now see our optimal deduction is actually itemizing in this particular scenario. And their taxable income then it's going to end up being this difference, that 163,800 in the base case versus 159,500 in that copied scenario. And I actually should have done this earlier. In tax year 2023, we might rename this to with 35,000 charitable donation. And then they can see that total tax liability with that charitable donation still remaining in the same marginal tax bracket, however, a lesser amount within that marginal tax bracket at 25,355, as opposed to taking the standard deduction, which would place them at 26,301 or approximately in that base case scenario. In our next example with Michael and Ann, we are going to look at what it would look like in the Holistiplan software within scenario analysis if you exceeded that AGI limitation that was discussed previously on Schedule A, where we saw there was that 60% AGI limit on a cash donation. So how we would model that is, and so you can see what happens with the carry forward amount. I would take this current situation and we're just going to make an assumption here. They've asked for an amount that's going to exceed the 60% of AGI in the modeling, so we can just show them, and so you can see how a carry forward would work for charitable donations. So I'm going to copy that base case again. And then here we have AGI 194,500. So let's just assume a fairly large charitable contribution. for example purposes. We're going to stick with cash here. I'm just going to say 125,000. They are feeling extra charitable this year. So as you can see, we put in 125,000, but we reached that 60% of AGI limitation. So we're allowed to take, as part of itemized deductions, 116,700, and then we'll have this unused charity carry forward amount of 8,300. And you'll see that, the itemized amount, 116,700. They could see taxable income significantly reduced because their itemizations are so large. And then that total tax liability, pretty low in consideration of the base case, and then taking the 35,000 charitable donation. What I wanted to show as well here, though, is how this carry forward amount um, will not necessarily reflect if we added like a 2024 situation. So we'll do tax year 2023, name this with, we did 125,000 charitable donation. And let's say we were going to copy, and then we'll take the one where we did that. It's just going to copy this over. It doesn't change this to then be the charitable amount, the, 8,300. We would have to manually update that to over to that next year, and you change 2024. So the thinking behind that is we don't want to make an assumption of a tax situation in a future year for a client. We're leaving that up to you as the advisor when working with them. This next example is to really serve as more of a note at this point in time, a reminder that if for some reason you're going back and doing a tax planning year for 2020 or 2021 that includes a charitable donation, that there was inclusion of that CARES Act as part of the tax law in both of those years, and that allows that $300 charitable donation above the line for a single filer, or up to 600 for married filing jointly. So how we would model that, or I just want to show how that's different from, for example, 2023, our base case. We'll add a scenario, copy that over. I'm going to use 2021 in this example. And then here we're changing that to the 2021 tax year. Current law respective of 2021. And then right here, we're making an assumption in this case that Michael and Ann are going to be using the standard deduction, but they made a $1,000 contribution to charity back in 2021. And just how you can see this new line item pops up, that's 2021 standard deduction charity. So then this case would, or this scenario would include the standard deduction respective of tax year 2021 for Michael and Ann, 27,800, plus that $600 deduction for a charitable contribution. Next, it may make sense for Michael and Ann Doe in their situation to potentially model what a donor advised fund scenario would look like, or a DAF. So these can be useful when there might be a situation in which a client wants to group multiple years of giving into one. And I'm going to model what that would look like with the example that Michael and Ann are normally contributing maybe an amount that's below the standard deduction. But if they were to increase that and do multiple years in 1 year, they would then be able to potentially itemize and itemize at a greater amount that supersedes that as standard deduction. So to model this, we want to add a scenario. We'll copy from our base case. And then like before, we are just going to our Schedule A. here, um, as I said, so we're going to assume they're traditionally donating 30,000 and now their standard deduction 30,700 exceeds that amount. So, and for example purposes, we'll make an assumption this is the only itemized item they could include. So let's say they want to do 2 years in one. That's going to be, whoops, hit a note. We'll do 60,000. And then now we have this new DAF explainer. So if we click in there, this can help you as the advisor form that conversation about, what is a donor advised fund with the client. You can scroll through quickly, just go through with them, how does that work? The additional details, how is it helpful? And then here we can model a couple different scenarios that I think could be helpful. So did you have a one-off income event this year? So let's say you had a year, this is a higher than normal income year, and we want to show what taking, that itemized deduction amount of 60,000 versus if we and doing 2 years of donations in one versus if we only did 1 year of 30,000, and then that leaves the standard deduction as higher, so then you're taking that versus itemizing. So this can just show you the difference about, a total tax situation with 2 years in one that would obviously lower your taxable income more than if we just take the standard deduction, which then ultimately you have a lower tax liability. And you can also change this, and I think this is super useful. So this charity lower than the standard deduction. So here is where you could put that 30,000. That's their typical annual charitable donations, number of years, 2 years we're going to model. Then here you may have to manually adjust that to reflect what their true standard deduction is for the client situation. Then if we collapse this, this is going to show us if over the next 2 years, because we're looking at 2 years of charitable donations combined into one. This over here on the left will show you that standard deduction being taken both in 2023 and 2024 because we're only giving that 30,000, leaving the standard to be higher. And with inflation, this could even be a little bit more, but for assumption purposes, we're keeping it the same. And then here, this is showing in 2023 how we have that itemized with the donor advised fund of 60,000, so 2 years in one. And then next year, because we did next year's in this year, we would take the standard again, so 30,700. And this is saying the total, deduction amounts added together over those 2 years. By doing that DAF example, we're getting more in the way of deductions, the total amount, that difference, being $29,300 greater than if we just did 2 years of the standard deduction, which would include those two 30,000 charitable donations. Finally, you may want to model a fairly popular example of charitable giving, and that is in the way of a qualified charitable distribution or QCD. Many times, clients who are charitably inclined, but then also taking an RMD from their IRA want to potentially utilize this strategy because that QCD amount can be used to offset in a way that RMD amount that they have to take or a portion thereof, because QCDs can count towards the RMD, which the RMD has to be taken from the IRA, as we are all aware of those rules working in this industry for those clients who have started their RMDs. So at age 70 and a half, a client would become eligible to do a QCD. And how we would want to model that is we will copy over their base case. And then before we were going down to the Schedule A and, using that itemized charitable distribution strategy here, we would want to go into the IRA worksheet instead. And then between these two sections of the worksheet, we would want to utilize that QCD strategy. So we're going to carry on that same example that they donate or they're charitably inclined to give 30,000 each year. In this example, they're going to give that in the way of QCDs. So we're going to just take taxpayer 1, taxpayer 2, an equal amount from each, reduce that by 15,000. So here, this becomes 60,000 taxable, 15,000 as part of the QCD, which is ultimately tax-free. Then here, 10,000 becomes taxable, and 15,000 is that tax-free amount. Within this worksheet, this will give you just this real quick, savings versus taking a taxable distribution, then donating with the itemized deduction. That's a 6,600 basically tax savings within their tax liability. And then here, savings versus a taxable distribution. There's no donation or deductions. In this example, it's the same 6,600. But what I want to pull up is this QCD explainer, because this is going to step into that number in a little bit more detail. So this is going to look very similar to that donor advised fund explainer that we talked about previously. This will go through, if you're having your conversation sitting down with the client about a QCD strategy, this will just go through what that is, the eligibility rules in order to do a QCD. As we discussed before, the taxpayer does have to be at least 70 and a half to make one. How does a QCD work? And then this section right here is going to help us step into that next conversation, which is that why are QCDs better than itemized charitable donations? So we had been talking about, and that doesn't mean that it necessarily is always better than an itemized charitable donation situation. But before this, we had been going through how to itemize those charitable donations, and now looking at charitable giving from just a different perspective in the way of a QCD, and how sometimes that can be a more optimal tax situation for a client to give through a QCD versus itemizing. And that's what this will show. So we remember that $6,600 amount that we talked about before. And this is basically stating, and this will, talk you through it if you're sitting down with the client. Our projection suggests that the 2023 overall tax bill would be lower by this $6,600 amount, or approximately, of if you were to donate via a QCD versus taking that taxable IRA distribution or having that amount included in the RMD and then taking an itemized charitable deduction for the same amount. So like before when we were modeling it on Schedule A. So, and this is just saying, this calculation assumes $30,000 in QCDs during 2023. And this will walk you through the math on that conversation. So how that QCD, remember, that's directly lowering the total income before deductions, because you're already going to start $30,000 less than in this situation where you might be itemizing or using that Schedule A charitable deduction amount. So this will walk you through. And side note, in this situation, in order to itemize, it would have to be more optimal than the standard deduction. If you actually go through the math in this particular scenario, if all we have for itemizing are the charitable deductions of 30,000, their standard deduction of 30,700 estimated for 2023 will actually be greater. So this taxable distribution, this column, will actually reflect 30,700 because they're taking the standard deduction. Where here, we're taking the QCD, 30,000, we're already starting less. And then if you were to dig into the math here behind these numbers, they're also taking that standard deduction amount. And this is going to show you how the client is saving about $6,600 in that tax, in their total tax, because in this situation they're paying about $19,700 in income tax, where on this side of the equation, they're paying about 26,300. So it's just a really good explainer that can go through, help walk the client through what a QCD is, and then just have that conversation if they are normally itemizing or as in way of giving, charitably, or if, you want to introduce that QCD and how that can work for them. And one other situation that might pop up, so here I'm going to rename this the 30K QCD scenario. And then what I want to do is add back that donor advised fund scenario, because maybe you're sitting down with the client, you're sitting down with Michael and Anne, and they know they want to possibly do a donor advised fund or a QCD, or how are they going to give? And this can help walk through which might be the most optimal choice for them. Here, this is the QCD. Here we have RMDs, that full amount taxable in the donor advised fund situation, but their Schedule A is what will look different than in the QCD. See here we have that $60,000 to a donor advised fund, basically 2 years of giving in one. And then you can see this taxable income in which situation is really more optimal for them. And we can see it's pretty close, but the QCD is, I guess, technically lower than that donor advised fund situation. So 2 years of giving in one versus if they just took 30,000 from the QCD in the way of giving in 2023, they would actually have a total tax liability that is a little bit less than if they did that itemization of 60,000. So all in all, just these are a few different ways that you can model charitable giving with your clients using Holistiplan.